I remember the exact fraction of a second when the pristine illusion of my life finally fractured, like a hairline crack spiderwebbing across a pane of tempered glass right before it completely gives way. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft ambient glow of the under-cabinet lighting. It was completely unremarkable, just another Tuesday in a long string of identical Tuesdays. I was standing at the oversized quartz island in our kitchen, methodically chopping yellow onions for a dinner. I barely had the appetite to eat, fighting a losing battle against the tears welling in my eyes. I told myself it wasn't because of anything emotional. It was just the onions. They always got to me, stinging my eyes and giving me a convenient excuse to wipe my face with the back of my sleeve. The sprawling suburban house smelled like roasting garlic, melting butter, and the faint, expensive scent of the cedarwood candle burning in the foyer. It was normal. It was safe. It was intensely, suffocatingly predictable. That was precisely the life I had curated for myself over the past 5 years. I had married Richard when I was 32. He was older than me by nearly a decade, already thoroughly established in private wealth management, already seasoned by the world, and already a father. His son, Jackson, had just turned 15 when I packed up my modest downtown apartment and moved into their sprawling colonial in the suburbs. It was an incredibly awkward age for him, and an entirely awkward situation for both of us. I was acutely aware of my boundaries. I wasn't trying to replace his mother, who had moved 2 states away to start over, and Jackson, fiercely protective of his own emotional real estate, wasn't rushing to let me in. For the first 2 years, we simply coexisted. Coexistence was the absolute best word for it. We were 2 celestial bodies orbiting the same sun, careful never to let our gravitational pulls collide. Over time, though, the sharp edges of our living arrangement began to soften. Jackson stopped slamming his bedroom door when he heard my car pull into the driveway. He traded his sullen glares for casual nods, and eventually started saying, "Hey," instead of treating me like an invisible specter haunting the hallways. On rare, quiet afternoons, he would even drag a stool up to the kitchen island while I cooked, one earbud dangling, endlessly scrolling through his phone, casually asking if we had any of those white cheddar popcorn bags left. It felt as though I had simply always been there. It wasn't maternal love, not exactly, but it was a sturdy, reliable kind of comfort. It felt like family. Richard worked grueling, relentless hours. That was the reality of high-stakes finance. He was always tethered to his phone, always pacing the home office on evening conference calls, always packing a garment bag for just one more impromptu trip to Chicago or New York. I told myself I understood the assignment. I convinced myself that this quiet, comfortable detachment was exactly what adult stability looked like. I reasoned that love didn't have to be a loud, constant cinematic spectacle to be genuine. But profound loneliness has an insidious way of creeping into the foundation of a marriage, finding the microscopic cracks and expanding them, even in a house bursting with expensive furniture and a teenager's echoing footsteps. That empty, hollow space is exactly where Julian came in. Julian was Richard's business partner. They were the same age, moved in the same elite circles, and wore the same tailored suits, but they possessed entirely different frequencies. Where Richard was meticulously controlled, pragmatic, and emotionally distant, Julian was a live wire. He was easygoing, quick to laugh, and deeply relaxed in his own skin. He was the kind of man who would actually hold your gaze when you spoke, making you feel as though you were the only person in the room whose words carried any weight. He started coming over to the house more frequently about a year ago, usually dragging a leather briefcase full of quarterly projections. In the beginning, it was strictly professional. It was catered dinners on the patio, heavy pours of Cabernet, and conversations that slowly drifted from market volatility and profit margins into personal anecdotes and shared histories. I genuinely didn't notice the exact moment the tectonic plates beneath us began to shift. Perhaps the catalyst was the rainy evening Richard got called away to handle an emergency client crisis halfway through the main course, leaving Julian and me alone at the massive mahogany dining table with a half-open bottle of reserve red wine. Maybe it was the deliberate way Julian chose to stay, leaning back in his chair instead of politely making an excuse to leave. Maybe it was the way we kept talking, our voices softening long after the risotto had gone completely cold on our plates. Or maybe the tension had been silently building long before that evening, taking root in the fleeting, stolen glances across the kitchen, the subtle, knowing smiles when Richard launched into one of his repetitive corporate monologues, and the undeniable way Julian's vibrant presence seemed to effortlessly fill the vast, echoing spaces that Richard's absence left behind. What I do know, with absolute certainty, is that the first time it finally happened, it didn't feel like a conscious decision. It felt like the inevitable surrender to gravity. Richard had flown out to a conference in Boston for the weekend. Jackson was spending the night at a friend's house across town. Julian had driven over to drop off some urgent contractual paperwork that required Richard's physical signature upon his return. That was the official narrative. That was the story he offered at the front door. And it was the lie I eagerly repeated to myself as I let him inside. But neither of us was stupid. We were two adults fully aware of the electricity crackling in the air. We stood in the exact same kitchen I was, in that fateful Tuesday evening, making hollow, meaningless small talk. The atmosphere felt dense, practically vibrating with unspoken intent. I vividly remember noticing just how profoundly quiet the empty house was, how the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the living room sounded deafening, counting down the seconds to an inevitable collapse. And then he reached out and touched my arm. It was such a simple, microscopic gesture, light, casual, almost disguised as accidental. But the heat of his fingers through the fabric of my sweater felt like a brand. I didn't step back. I didn't pull away. I should have. God, if I had an ounce of self-preservation, I should have bolted. But I stayed perfectly still. Everything that transpired after that initial touch happened with a disorienting blend of warp speed and agonizing slow motion. It was as if my consciousness had detached from my body, hovering in the corner of the ceiling, watching myself ruin my life while being entirely powerless to hit the brakes. I remember the firm weight of his hand sliding to my waist, the abrupt chill of the quartz counter pressing hard against my lower back, and the desperate way I breathed his name into the quiet room. It sounded like a plea, or perhaps a warning, as if a tiny, rational part of my brain was begging him to be the one to stop this. He didn't, and neither did I. Long after the front door clicked shut behind him, I remember standing barefoot on the cold tile of the master bathroom, gripping the edges of the vanity, and staring relentlessly at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked exactly the same. My hair was a little messy, my eyes a little wide, but physically, nothing had changed. Yet, fundamentally, every single atom of my reality had been permanently rewritten. I aggressively lied to myself the next morning. I categorized it as a catastrophic lapse in judgment, a drunken, one-time anomaly driven by neglect, something that would naturally dissolve into the ether if I just ignored it with enough conviction. But it didn't dissolve, it calcified. It evolved into something regular, structured, and dangerously intoxicating. It was incredibly quiet, meticulously controlled, an entire illicit universe hidden in plain sight. It was comprised of stolen, breathless afternoons, when Richard was delayed at the office, or Jackson was locked in his bedroom gaming. It was the thrill of quick, electrifying touches in the hallway, when we hosted dinner parties. It was a digital trail of desperate texts that we religiously deleted the second they were read. It was a secondary language of conversations that never technically crossed a boundary out loud, but vibrated with intense forbidden meaning in the silences between the words. I knew it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I knew it every single time I heard Julian's car pull into the driveway. Every time I smoothed my clothes before opening the door. But the crushing weight of that guilt did absolutely nothing to stop me. If anything, the sheer toxicity of the secret acted as an accelerant. There was an undeniable, narcotic thrill in the risk. It felt as though Julian and I were the only two living, breathing people in a world entirely populated by mannequins. He made the dull, monochromatic landscape of my suburban life burst into blinding, vibrant color. It made everything sharper, vastly more intense, and dangerously addictive. And then there was Jackson. In the chaotic beginning of the affair, I didn't factor Jackson into the equation much at all. That sounds remarkably callous, and frankly, terrible, I know. But it is the unvarnished truth. He was just a peripheral figure, existing in his own isolated teenage ecosystem. He was consumed by high school drama, track practice, his tight-knit circle of friends, and walking around with oversized noise, canceling headphones practically fused to his ears. His bedroom door was a permanent barricade. But as the months bled into one another, I started noticing subtle, unsettling shifts in his periphery. The way his eyes would linger on me just a fraction of a second too long when I was texting. It wasn't overtly suspicious, not exactly. It was more of an acute observation, as if he was a detective slowly piecing together a puzzle he didn't quite have the box art for. It was the way he would casually stroll into the kitchen to grab a drink and suddenly freeze, pausing in the doorway for a beat too long if Julian and I were already standing there, caught in a conversation that suddenly sounded way too rehearsed. It was the way his questions began to subtly change, morphing from grunts into pointed inquiries. Is Dad actually coming home for dinner tonight? Why is Julian stopping by again? Didn't he literally just come over to drop those files off yesterday? I was armed with an arsenal of perfectly crafted, airtight answers. They were easy, dismissive, and fiercely normal. They were the exact kind of mundane explanations that successfully deflect attention, as long as the person asking doesn't look too closely at the subtle tremor in your hands. But teenagers possess a terrifying radar-like intuition for hypocrisy, especially not a kid who had already sat front row for the slow, agonizing disintegration of his parents' first marriage. I should have slammed on the brakes the absolute second I noticed that microscopic shift in his demeanor. I should have recognized the dangerous awareness blooming behind his eyes, the casual curiosity that was starting to feel a little too sharp, a little too precise. But I didn't stop, because by that juncture I was drowning, and the water was way over my head. The affair had violently mutated beyond the physical realm. It was deeply emotional. It was chaotic, messy, and infinitely complicated. Julian actively knew things about my internal landscape that Richard hadn't bothered to ask in half a decade. He saw the dark, complicated, entirely unpolished fragments of my personality that I had willingly buried just to keep the machinery of my marriage running smoothly. When I was with Julian, I felt awake. That is the only word that adequately encapsulates the sensation. Awake. And once you have been violently shaken out of a 5-year emotional coma, the prospect of willingly going back to sleep feels like a death sentence. So I kept my eyes wide open. I kept lying through my teeth. I kept meticulously pretending that the foundation of our home wasn't quietly rotting away beneath our feet. Right up until that very Tuesday evening, the pungent smell of charring onions snapped me out of my trance. I had completely stopped paying attention to the sauté pan. I quickly reached out, aggressively twisting the burner dial down to low, and wiped my stinging eyes with the back of my wrist. I took a deep, shaky breath, picked up the heavy santoku knife, and turned my attention back to the wooden cutting board. That was the exact moment Jackson strolled into the kitchen. I honestly didn't hear him approach. For a 17-year-old boy who was practically wearing men's shoes, he moved with the stealth of a shadow. He was much taller now, his shoulders broadening out, shedding the last lingering traces of his childhood awkwardness. He was standing directly in the threshold of adulthood. "Hey," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of inflection. I physically jumped, a sharp gasp escaping my lips. It was a wildly disproportionate reaction to a simple greeting, and we both knew it. "Hey, geez, I didn't even hear you come downstairs." He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He just shrugged a single shoulder, walking past me to yank open the heavy stainless steel door of the refrigerator. He grabbed a can of soda, popping the tab with a loud metallic snap. Yeah, a thick, suffocating pause settled over the granite countertops. This wasn't entirely unprecedented. Our casual conversations often possessed a slightly awkward, unfinished quality. I immediately looked back down at the cutting board, desperately trying to project an aura of total domestic normalcy. I focused all my remaining mental energy on chopping, actively trying to ignore the sudden oppressive tension rapidly expanding in the air between us. He didn't retreat to his bedroom. Instead, he leaned back heavily against the counter, directly across from the island, crossing his ankles, and simply watched me. I didn't need to look up to feel the heavy weight of his stare. It was a steady, unblinking, quietly analytical attention that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "What?" I finally asked, looking up and forcing a painfully brittle smile onto my face. "Do I have mascara running down my face or something?" He didn't return the smile. That was the first glaring alarm bell that something was catastrophically wrong. Usually, if I offered a lame joke, he would at least fake a polite chuckle or roll his eyes before wandering off. But this time, his features remained carved from stone. He just kept staring at me, his eyes dark and completely unreadable. And then he finally dropped the match into the gasoline. It came completely out of nowhere. His tone was perfectly calm. In fact, it was terrifyingly calm. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the heavy steel knife still clutched tightly in my right hand. For absolutely no justifiable reason, my heart slammed against my ribs, kicking into a panicked, erratic rhythm. "Sure," I said, my voice sounding an octave higher than normal. Another agonizing pause stretched between us. This one was significantly longer than the last. It felt deeply deliberate, as if he was carefully sorting through an arsenal of words, selecting the sharpest ones available. And then he asked, "Why does Julian always come over when Dad's out of town?" It was structurally such a simple, innocent question, but the impact felt like a physical blow to the sternum. For a terrifying 2 seconds, my lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. My mind went blindingly white, completely stripped of any coherent thought or prepared alibi. I forcefully swallowed, the panic rising in my throat, and let out a light, breathy laugh that sounded completely fake even to my own ears. It was meant to sound dismissive, like he had just asked why the sky was blue. "He is your dad's senior business partner, Jackson. You know how crazy their quarterly deadlines are." "Yeah," he replied instantly, his voice completely devoid of agreement. He was still locked onto my eyes. He still wasn't smiling, but Dad's not here. Something dark and icy twisted deep in my stomach, turning my blood to freon. I aggressively broke eye contact, turning my head back down to the cutting board, staring blankly at the diced onions. My hands were visibly trembling now. Sometimes he just needs to drop physical documents off. I stammered out, slicing blindly at a piece of onion. "Or they need to go over the portfolio numbers on speakerphone. It's really not a big deal, Jackson." The silence that followed was suffocating. It stretched out, warping the dimensions of the room, growing heavier and heavier, until the pressure in my ears felt unbearable. And then his voice cut through the quiet sharper than the knife in my hand. "That is not what I meant." I completely froze. The stainless steel blade stopped dead on the wood. My hand hovered paralyzed in midair. I couldn't breathe. Slowly, painfully, like a rusted machine, I lifted my chin and looked across the island at him. And for the very first time since the day I moved into this house, Jackson didn't look like an awkward, sullen teenager. He looked entirely like a man. He looked like someone holding all the cards, a prosecutor who already possessed the definitive answer, and was merely waiting in silence to see exactly how desperately the guilty party was willing to lie. I didn't answer him right away. I physically couldn't. My brain felt as though someone had thrown a bucket of water onto an electrical panel. Every single possible lie, denial, and justification was violently colliding in my head, and absolutely none of them sounded remotely convincing. The massive open-concept kitchen suddenly felt incredibly claustrophobic, the walls aggressively pressing inward, threatening to crush me against the granite. Jackson didn't shift his weight. He didn't nervously fill the dead air the way most people instinctively do when a social interaction becomes unbearably awkward. He just stood there, leaning against the counter, perfectly patient. And his patience made the terror infinitely worse. I slowly set the knife down onto the cutting board, focusing all my energy on making sure the blade didn't rattle against the wood to betray how violently my hands were shaking. I wiped my palms on the front of my apron. "What do you mean?" I asked. I already knew the answer. God. I knew exactly what he meant. The words slipped out of my mouth much softer than I had intended. It wasn't the sharp, authoritative tone of a stepmother. It wasn't even the indignant, defensive tone of an innocent woman. It sounded like a surrender. He let out a short, quiet exhale through his nose, a sound that conveyed he had fully expected me to play dumb. "You know exactly what I mean, Elena," he said, using my first name in a way that felt completely jarring. I forced my legs to move, turning my body entirely around, so my back was pressed hard against the edge of the island, desperately hoping the solid wood would somehow anchor me to reality. "Jackson, if you are trying to imply something, you need to just say it out loud." A slight defensive edge had finally crept into my voice. It wasn't genuine anger, though. It was blind panic clumsily disguised as parental authority. His dark eyes remained locked onto mine, unblinking. "I've seen him," he stated, his voice completely level. That was the kill shot. Those 3 simple syllables. Everything solid inside my chest completely collapsed, plunging into my stomach. "Seen him." "Do what?" I tried, my voice cracking in the middle of the sentence, pathetically clinging to the absolute last, frayed thread of plausible deniability. He tilted his head just a fraction of an inch to the left, looking at me with an expression that bordered on pity. He couldn't believe I was still insulting his intelligence. "Come into your bedroom," he said. My mouth opened, but all the moisture had instantly evaporated from my throat. My lips moved, but the air simply bypassed my vocal cords. "I've heard you too," he added, dropping his volume slightly. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't hurling accusations, or throwing his soda can across the room. It was devastatingly factual. There was absolutely no theatrical drama, no explosive teenage rage. It was just a steady, unrelenting calmness that made the nightmare I was living feel impossibly, undeniably real. My heart was hammering against my ribs with such violent force. I was genuinely afraid he could see it moving under my shirt. The blood rushing past my ears sounded like a freight train. "How long?" I whispered into the quiet kitchen. I couldn't stop the question from escaping. His expression finally shifted, just a microscopic crack in his armor. It wasn't anger, it looked like profound, heavy disappointment. "A while," he answered quietly. A while that was a horrifyingly vague metric. That could mean 2 weeks. It could mean 6 months. Oh my God, I reached behind me, gripping the cold lip of the quartz countertop so hard my knuckles instantly turned bone. White, I needed the physical grounding just to stay on my feet. Why didn't you say anything to me? I pleaded, my voice trembling so badly it was barely holding its shape. He offered a grim, hollow shrug, but the movement felt entirely rehearsed. It was glaringly obvious that he had played out this exact confrontation in the solitude of his bedroom 1,000 times over. What exactly was I supposed to say, Elena? He replied, a bitter edge finally bleeding into his tone. Hey Dad, how was Chicago? By the way, I think your wife is screwing your business partner while you are at the office. Hearing the brutal, unfiltered reality of my actions, spoken out loud in a teenager's voice, hit me harder than anything else. There was no more hiding behind vague justifications or romanticized notions of being seen. The ugly truth was standing under the fluorescent lights. I started, raising a trembling hand, but I immediately snapped my mouth shut. Because what earthly defense could I possibly mount? That it was just a misunderstanding, that the emotional dynamics were incredibly nuanced, that it fundamentally didn't mean anything. Every single one of those statements was a catastrophic lie, and even if they possessed a shred of truth, it wouldn't change the reality of the wreckage scattered at my feet. Jackson pushed himself off the far counter and slowly closed the distance between us, taking 3 deliberate steps forward. His posture wasn't aggressive or physically threatening. He just wanted to be close enough that I couldn't escape his gaze. I didn't want to deal with it, he confessed, the anger draining out of his voice, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I figured, look, it is your life. It is your mess to clean up. But then you just kept doing it. He shook his head, staring at me like I was a stranger. You kept bringing him into our house, like you didn't even care if anyone noticed. I did care. I blurted out instantly, the desperate, pathetic words spilling past my lips before my brain could filter them. I swear to you, I do care. He stopped walking. About what? He asked, his voice sharp and direct. And that perfectly aimed, singular question completely dismantled me, because what exactly was I claiming to care about? Was it my vows? I was actively, repeatedly desecrating them. Was it Julian? I didn't even have a tangible definition for whatever toxic entanglement we had created. Was it Jackson? I hadn't spared a single genuine thought regarding the collateral damage this would inflict on him until the bomb had already detonated in my face. I opened my mouth to speak, desperately searching the empty air for an answer, and then closed it again, completely defeated. He watched me struggle, watched the pathetic gears turning in my head, and the lingering softness in his eyes completely hardened into ice. Yeah, he muttered quietly, looking away in disgust. That is exactly what I thought. That is incredibly unfair, I whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking hot paths down my cheeks, even though my conscience was screaming that he was entirely justified. Fair, he repeated, letting out a sharp, dark laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. Are you seriously standing there talking to me about what is fair? I flinched visibly, as if he had raised a hand to strike me. Jackson, please. I am not trying to pick a fight with you, I stammered, wiping at my face. This is adult stuff. This isn't something you can easily understand from the outside. Then explain it to me, he fired back instantly, taking another step closer. The sudden, fiery intensity in his voice caught me entirely off guard. Go ahead, Elena. Explain how any of this makes logical sense. He gestured wildly around the kitchen. Because from where I am standing, from the outside, it just looks like you are selfishly screwing over my dad in his own house. The sheer, unapologetic bluntness of his words stung like a physical lash across my face, even though I knew I deserved every single syllable. It is not that simple, I pleaded, desperately shaking my head, my voice breaking. It looks pretty damn simple to me, he countered coldly. A heavy, suffocating beat of silence dropped over the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, and then, dropping his voice to a soft, devastating whisper, he delivered the final blow. He trusts you, you know. That observation completely gutted me. It was the absolute, undeniable truth. Richard trusted me implicitly. He never once scrolled through my phone. He never once interrogated me about where I had been all afternoon or who I was having lunch with. He possessed a blind, unwavering faith in my character, and I had systematically weaponized that beautiful trust to destroy him behind his back. I swallowed a sob, unable to look Jackson in the eye anymore, my gaze dropping to the hardwood floor. I know, I choked out, a tear falling from my chin. Jackson remained silent for a long moment, simply watching me cry, and then he asked a question I genuinely wasn't prepared for. Do you even feel bad about it? I snapped my head up, completely taken aback, quickly wiping my wet cheeks. What? Do you actually feel bad? He repeated, his tone entirely devoid of teenage sarcasm or attitude. It was a genuine, desperate inquiry into my humanity, and the sincerity of the question made the shame practically unbearable. Or is lying to his face just totally normal for you now? Of course I feel terrible, I sobbed, my voice cracking violently, the emotional dam finally breaking. I feel sick about it every single day. Then why do you keep doing it? I didn't have a remotely acceptable answer. I could have unleashed a litany of tragic excuses. I could have cried about the crushing isolation, about how Richard was married to his firm, and I was just an accessory he kept in the suburbs. I could have explained that Julian made me feel vibrant, desired, and deeply visible, sensations that had been starved out of me for years. But looking into the eyes of a 17-year-old boy whose family I was actively detonating, all of those reasons sounded exactly like what they were: pathetic, selfish justifications. I don't know, I whispered into the quiet room. It was the very first completely honest sentence I had uttered since he walked into the kitchen. Jackson carefully studied my tear-streaked face for a long time, as if analyzing the micro-expressions to determine if I was feeding him another line. Yeah, he finally murmured, shifting his weight. Actually, I think you do. I sniffled, wiping my nose with the back of my hand, my brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? I think you know exactly why you are doing it, he said softly, his voice echoing in the large room. You just don't possess the guts to say it out loud. A cold band of anxiety tightened sharply around my chest, making it hard to draw breath. Because if you finally say it out loud, Jackson continued, his eyes piercing straight through my soul, then you have to look in the mirror and admit you are actively choosing to do it. The psychological precision of his statement hit me harder and deeper than any insult he could have hurled. Choosing it, not slipping, not making a tragic, helpless mistake. I wasn't a victim of circumstance. I was making a conscious, calculated choice every single time I unbuttoned my shirt. I closed my eyes, physically unable to hold his penetrating gaze any longer. The silence stretched out between us once more, impossibly heavy and utterly suffocating. And then, with ruthless efficiency, he pivoted the entire trajectory of the confrontation, ripping away the last shred of my control. So what are you going to do about it? He asked, his voice steady. I opened my tear-filled eyes, blinking rapidly in confusion, completely thrown off balance. What are you talking about? I mean, now that I know the truth, he clarified, stepping slightly closer. Now that you look at me and know that I know, what happens next, Elena? I stared at him, completely paralyzed. I had been entirely consumed by the blinding panic of the present moment. The raw terror of simply being discovered, that I hadn't even begun to formulate a strategy for the aftermath. "I don't know," I stammered honestly, my voice shaking. He nodded slowly, his face grim, as if my lack of a plan merely confirmed his lowest expectations. "Because you understand you can't just keep playing house and pretending anymore," he stated flatly. "Not in front of me. I wasn't planning on pretending with you," I said defensively. Though looking deep into my own heart, I honestly wasn't sure if that was true. I probably would have tried. He looked at me for a long, agonizing minute. The silence felt heavy with impending grief. And then, his voice dropping to a quiet, sorrowful register, he delivered the absolute truth. "You are going to destroy him." The stark simplicity of the sentence made it feel completely, terrifyingly unavoidable. He didn't say I might hurt him. He didn't say I could ruin things going to. It was a guaranteed destination. I know, I wept softly, fresh tears spilling over my eyelashes. "And you are probably still going to keep doing it anyway," he added, a bitter edge returning to his voice. I didn't offer a defense, because, looking at my track record, what possible reassurance could I offer that wouldn't sound like another lie? He exhaled a long, shaky breath, reaching up to run a hand aggressively through his dark hair. The severe adult mask he had been wearing finally slipped, and for a fleeting second, he looked exactly his age again. He looked like a vulnerable 17-year-old kid who had been violently dragged into a traumatic adult nightmare he had zero desire to participate in. "I didn't want any part of this mess," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I still don't want to be involved." "You are not involved, Jackson," I pleaded, stepping toward him instinctively, desperately wanting to protect him from the fallout. But he held up a hand, cutting me off instantly. "I am now," he corrected me firmly, "because I hold the secret. And that means the burden is on me to decide if I blow up my dad's life and tell him, or if I keep my mouth shut and lie to his face every day." A fresh wave of terror crashed over me, making my knees physically weak. "Jackson, please," I begged, my voice shrill and panicked. "Please don't do that." "Don't do what?" he interrupted sharply, his eyes flashing. "Tell my own father the truth?" The way he framed the sentence wasn't deliberately cruel. It was merely a reflection of the horrific reality I had constructed. "Please," I sobbed, gripping the counter for support. "This information will completely destroy him." He stared at my crying face, an entirely unreadable expression settling over his features. "You already are destroying him, Elena," he stated coldly. "You are just doing it behind his back." I absorbed that blow in silence. We stood there, frozen in the bright kitchen, the massive, unbearable weight of the betrayal hanging suspended in the air between us. And then he quietly offered a statement that completely shifted the ground beneath my feet. Once again, I haven't told him yet. I stopped crying for a second, violently wiping my face, my eyes darting to his. "Why not?" I asked, terrified of the answer. He hesitated, shifting his weight uneasily. Just for a fleeting second, and in that tiny window of hesitation, the entire atmospheric pressure of the room changed. An unfamiliar, deeply unsettling undercurrent began to pull at the air. I couldn't immediately identify what it was, but the hair on my arms stood up. "I don't know," he finally murmured, looking down at his sneakers. "Maybe I just wanted to see exactly how you'd react when you found out I knew." My stomach performed a sickening flip. "What exactly does that mean, Jackson?" I asked cautiously, my voice tight with sudden apprehension. He slowly lifted his head, locking his dark eyes onto mine, and the expression resting on his face was entirely new. It wasn't the righteous anger of a protective son. It wasn't the crushing disappointment of a betrayed family member. It was something significantly darker, more calculating, and vastly more complicated. "I guess," he said slowly, dragging the syllables out, "it entirely depends on you." The quiet, deliberate way he delivered those 4 words sent a violent shiver sprinting down my spine. The kitchen suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Depends on me how. I pressed, my voice barely a whisper, dread pooling in my gut. He didn't offer immediate clarification. He just stood perfectly still, letting his eyes slowly travel up and down my form. He looked at me long enough for the profound silence to morph from awkward into actively dangerous. And when he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice was a smooth, quiet murmur that barely carried across the island. But I think you already know exactly what I mean. I felt the implications of his words hit my brain a split second before my conscious mind could fully process them. The tectonic plates of our dynamic violently realigned. The subtle, horrifying change in the way Jackson was looking at me. It wasn't just a teenager holding a grudge anymore. It was something illicit, something deeply inappropriate. And the very millisecond I realized what he might be suggesting, the panic in my chest flared so hot and fast it practically burned my throat. "No!" I gasped instinctively, aggressively shaking my head, and taking a large, hurried step backward, putting more distance between us. Whatever crazy idea is going through your head right now, you are entirely wrong. But even as the denial left my lips, I wasn't entirely sure what specific accusation I was trying to fight off. Jackson didn't backtrack or look embarrassed. He didn't display a shred of confusion. He simply maintained that steady, unnerving stare. "I didn't say anything, Elena," he replied smoothly, his tone remarkably calm. "You didn't have to say anything." I shot back, my voice rising in volume, laced with sheer panic. My chest was heaving. I can vividly see exactly where this conversation is attempting to go. And I am telling you, no, absolutely not. This is not okay. That outburst finally provoked a physical reaction. A very small one. The muscle in his jaw ticked slightly, and he let out a quiet, slow breath through his teeth, as if he was actively attempting to rein his temper back in. "Okay," he challenged, crossing his arms over his chest. "Then you stand there and tell me exactly what is okay in this house." I blinked rapidly, momentarily derailed by the pivot. "What? Tell me. What is actually okay here?" he demanded, aggressively gesturing between the two of us, and then throwing his hand out to indicate the empty house around us. "Because judging from the front row seat I've had, absolutely none of this is. That is exactly my point," I practically yelled, taking another defensive step backward until my shoulder blades hit the stainless steel refrigerator. I desperately needed physical space, even though he hadn't moved an inch toward me. This entire situation is already a catastrophic mess. We do not make it worse. His dark eyes narrowed slightly, zeroing in on my face. "Worse," he repeated, rolling the word around in his mouth like a bitter candy. "Yes, Jackson, worse," I cried out, throwing my hands up in sheer desperation. "Look, you are incredibly upset, and you have every right in the world to be furious with me. I deserve it, but whatever twisted game you are thinking about playing right now, this is absolutely not the way to handle it." He stared at me in silence, for what felt like an eternity. The hum of the refrigerator vibrated against my back, and then, completely catching me off guard, he let out a quiet, almost genuinely amused breath. "Are you serious right now?" he asked, a cynical smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You think I am trying to, what, blackmail you into sleeping with me?" The ugly, taboo words hung suspended in the sterile kitchen air, toxic and heavy. I hesitated, nervously licking my dry lips. "I don't know what you are trying to accomplish," I said carefully, terrified of setting off a landmine. "But you literally just stood there and said it depends on me." "So yeah, Jackson," it heavily sounded exactly like that. He slowly shook his head, looking down at the hardwood floor for a long second, the smirk completely vanishing. When he finally looked back up, the dark intensity was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine pain. "It is not like that," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. The whiplash of his emotional shifts was giving me vertigo. "Then what is it like?" I pressed, my voice trembling. Another massive pause dropped between us. This one felt significantly heavier, laden with years of unspoken baggage. He stumbled over his words, exhaling a long, frustrated breath as he tried to mentally organize his thoughts. "I just honestly don't get it." "What don't you get?" I asked softly. "You," he stated simply, looking right through me. The blunt answer caught me entirely off guard. "Me, yeah, you," he confirmed, nodding his head. "I don't get how you can stand there in this kitchen, chopping vegetables, and act like everything is perfectly normal. Like you are still the exact same person who moved in here 5 years ago." His words pierced straight through my chest, stinging far worse than the accusations of cheating. "I am not acting, Jackson," I pleaded, though even to my own ears, my voice lacked any real conviction. "You are, though," he argued, his tone hardening again. "You walk around acting like you are this deeply caring person, like this betrayal is totally tearing you apart inside. But then you just wake up the next morning and keep doing it." I swallowed hard, a massive lump forming in my throat, choking off my air supply. It is complicated," I whispered, instantly hating myself for using such a hollow, cowardly cliché. He fiercely shook his head. "No, Elena, it really isn't," he shot back. "You just desperately don't want to look in the mirror and face reality." The anger and profound frustration that he had been so carefully managing was finally beginning to boil over, fracturing the calm, adult facade he had been projecting. "Do you honestly think I don't see it?" he demanded, his voice rising in volume. "The pathetic way you act whenever Julian is in the room. The desperate, needy way you look at him when you think nobody else is watching." I felt a violent rush of heat flood my cheeks, a toxic cocktail of profound humiliation, shame, and something far darker that I absolutely refused to name out loud. "Jackson, please stop," I commanded, trying to inject some authority into my shaky voice. "No, you stop," he yelled back, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "Stop standing there pretending like this affair is some tragic, unavoidable accident that you just magically tripped and fell into." I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a deep, shuddering breath, desperately trying to anchor myself to the floor. "I am not pretending," I said, my voice barely a cracked whisper. "I know exactly the magnitude of what I've done." "Then why does it constantly feel like you don't?" he demanded, throwing his hands up in sheer exasperation. I didn't have an answer for him. Once again, my silence was the only truth I had left to offer. He stared intensely at my face, his eyes desperately searching my features for a trace of the woman he thought he knew, an explanation that would suddenly make sense of the chaos. And then, the fiery teenage frustration melted away, leaving behind a quiet, deeply personal sorrow. "You know, you weren't always like this," he murmured quietly. The unexpected observation caught me completely off guard. I opened my eyes. "What?" "You weren't," he repeated, a sad, nostalgic smile touching his lips. "When you first moved into this house with Dad, you were totally different." I furrowed my brow, genuinely confused by this sudden trip down memory lane. "Different how?" "I don't know," he sighed, shrugging his broad shoulders loosely. "Just different, warmer. You actually tried, you know. With me, with the house, with everything." "I still try," I protested instantly, the words flying out of my mouth defensively. He offered a small, devastatingly sad smile, shaking his head slowly. "No, Elena, you really don't." That simple denial hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. "I cook dinner every night." I started, gesturing vaguely toward the chopped onions on the island, desperately trying to list my domestic contributions, but he aggressively cut me off. That is exactly my point. That is not what I mean, he argued. Yeah, you chop the onions. You go through the physical motions of being here, but you are not actually here anymore. You are a ghost. I opened my mouth to launch into a fierce argument, to list all the ways I was present, but the words died in my throat, because the horrific truth was, a tiny buried part of my soul knew with absolute certainty that he was 100% right. I had checked out of this marriage, and this house. When exactly did that change? Elena, he asked, his voice soft, almost pleading for an honest answer. The heavy question lingered in the sterile air between us. I easily could have lied to his face again. I could have feigned ignorance, claiming I didn't know what he was talking about. But standing there, pinned beneath his gaze, after all the brutal honesty that had already been excavated, lying felt entirely pointless. I don't know, I admitted softly, a single tear slipping down my cheek. He watched me cry for a few seconds, then gave a slow, knowing nod. Yeah, he whispered. I think you do. There it was again, that terrifying, unwavering certainty, that bizarre, almost supernatural ability to strip away my defenses and see directly into my core in a way Richard never had, and Julian never bothered to try. It made me feel violently exposed, profoundly uncomfortable, and terrifyingly deeply understood. And I vehemently hated that last part most of all. Why are you doing this, Jackson? I asked, my voice completely devoid of energy, sounding older than my years. I was just so unbelievably tired. Doing what? He countered. This, I said, weakly gesturing between the two of us, pushing this horrific conversation to the absolute limit, digging into my brain like this. He hesitated, and for the very first time since he had strolled into the kitchen, the absolute certainty vanished from his eyes. He looked genuinely unsure, like a teenager who had suddenly realized he was driving a car way too fast. It lasted for exactly 1 second, and then the mask slammed back into place. Because somebody in this house has to, he stated firmly. But why does it have to be you? I pleaded. Because I am the only one who actually knows the truth, he replied instantly, the logic airtight. The brutal simplicity of his reasoning made it utterly impossible to argue against. We collapsed back into silence, but the texture of the silence had fundamentally changed. It was significantly less sharp, less like a Mexican standoff, and vastly more complicated. Jackson shifted his weight awkwardly, shooting a quick, nervous glance down the dark hallway leading to the foyer before locking his eyes back on me. Are you ever going to actually tell him? He asked, the weight of the question dropping like an anvil. The words felt impossibly heavy. I honestly don't know, Jackson, I confessed, my voice shaking. He nodded slowly, his jaw tight figures. I genuinely mean it, I insisted, desperate for him to understand my paralysis. I have absolutely no idea what I am going to do. Yeah, well, that is kind of the massive problem here. Elena, he shot back, a hint of the earlier anger returning. I know, I wept, bowing my head. Another agonizing pause. Then, dropping his voice to a hushed, urgent whisper, he said, You know you are going to get caught eventually, right? You are not invisible. My stomach violently twisted into a series of knots. I know. And you have to know that it is going to be infinitely worse for Dad if he finds out from someone who isn't you. I know, I repeated like a broken record, my voice barely audible over the hum of the fridge. He studied my defeated posture for a long time, and then he softly uttered a sentence that made my chest tighten to the point of genuine physical pain. But for an entirely different reason than before. I haven't told Dad yet because, he started, and then abruptly stopped. He looked away, his brow furrowed deeply, as if he was violently debating internally whether he should finish the thought. I prompted gently, terrified he would close off again. He slowly looked back up at me, and he really looked at me. It wasn't the accusatory glare of a prosecutor anymore. It wasn't the cynical analysis of an angry teenager. He was just looking. And there was a raw, unfiltered vulnerability in his dark eyes that I absolutely could not ignore. I wanted to understand. He finally whispered. "Understand what?" I asked, entirely lost. "Why him?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. The question hung suspended in the air, structurally simple, yet carrying. I hesitated, desperately searching for a safe harbor in this conversation. "Jackson, you wouldn't get it," I said softly, trying to protect him from the ugly details. "Try me," he challenged instantly, crossing his arms, his jaw set in stubborn determination. I closed my eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, aggressively running my trembling fingers through my hair. The dam was breaking, and I couldn't hold the water back anymore. "It is not just about Julian," I started, the words tumbling out. "It is about the entire ecosystem of my life." "That is a dodge, not an answer," he accurately pointed out. "I know it is," I admitted, opening my eyes to meet his gaze. "But it is also the absolute truth." He didn't argue, he didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, watching me, waiting for me to bleed. I felt a massive tectonic shift occurring deep inside my chest. A horrifying pressure had been building behind my ribs for months, and I suddenly realized that if I didn't finally say something real, something brutally, unforgivably honest, I was physically going to shatter into pieces. "I was so unbelievably lonely, Jackson," I finally confessed, the tears flowing freely now. The word lonely felt entirely inadequate, incredibly small compared to the crushing, suffocating void it represented. Jackson didn't blink. He didn't offer a sarcastic retort. He just listened. So I kept digging my own grave. "Your dad, Richard, is a genuinely good man," I sobbed, my hands gripping the edge of the granite he provides. "He is stable, but he is not actually here, not in any of the ways that emotionally matter to a marriage." "That still doesn't justify sleeping with his business partner," Jackson stated quietly, his moral compass pointing dead north. "I know it doesn't," I cried out quickly, desperately wanting him to know I wasn't seeking absolution. "I am absolutely not saying it justifies anything. I am just trying to explain the reality of my head." He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, signaling for me to continue walking through the minefield. "And Julian," I hesitated, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. I swallowed hard and pushed through the shame. "Julian made me feel seen. He looked at me, and he actually saw a living, breathing woman. He made me feel like my existence mattered. Like I wasn't just a piece of expensive furniture fading into the background of Richard's life." The sheer, naked honesty of the confession made my chest ache so fiercely, I thought I might be having a heart attack. Jackson's stoic expression didn't change drastically, but the tension around his eyes softened slightly. I could tell he was genuinely absorbing the words. And once that door finally opened, I whispered, the fight completely draining out of me, "I honestly didn't know how to close it again." "That sounds exactly like a choice," he observed quietly. "It is," I sobbed, my shoulders shaking. "It is a choice I make every single time." A heavy, mournful silence settled over the kitchen once more, but this time the texture had completely changed. It no longer felt like a hostage negotiation. It felt like two survivors standing in the smoking crater of a bomb blast, surrounded by something incredibly fragile that was perfectly balancing on the edge of total collapse. Jackson exhaled a long, shaky breath, breaking eye contact to stare at the stainless steel oven for a few seconds before slowly bringing his gaze back to mine. "I still don't get it," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "I don't expect you to," I replied, wiping my raw eyes. "You shouldn't have to." He nodded in agreement. Another long pause stretched between us, and then, almost entirely under his breath, he muttered. "It is so messed up." "Yeah," I agreed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "It really, really is." We stood suspended in the quiet house for a long moment, both of us physically crushed by the massive weight of the truths that had just been dragged into the light. And then, just when I thought the worst was over, he asked the final, devastating question that caused the entire room to violently spin off its axis. "Do you love him?" I completely froze. I didn't stop because I misheard the question. I froze because I was absolutely terrified of the answer, and I didn't know how to possibly articulate it out loud without the remaining fragments of my life instantly combusting. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. Jackson didn't push. He didn't yell or demand an immediate response. He just stood there, leaning casually against the counter, watching me actively drown in my own hesitation, utilizing that same quiet, terrifying patience that had made this entire confrontation feel like an inescapable trap. "Do you love him, Elena?" he repeated, his voice even softer this time, almost gentle. I let out a ragged, trembling breath, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the cold edge of the quartz island behind me, desperately trying to keep myself upright. "I don't know," I finally choked out. The words felt incredibly weak, cowardly, and entirely pathetic the exact second they passed my lips. Jackson's facial expression barely moved, but a profound shadow crossed his dark eyes. It was a potent mixture of deep disappointment and grim confirmation. "You don't know," he echoed softly, his tone laced with disbelief. "It is not that black and white, Jackson," I pleaded, furiously shaking my head, desperate to make him understand the chaos in my chest. "What I feel for Julian, it is not just one simple thing you can put a label on." "That is exactly not what I asked you," he countered sharply, cutting through my excuses. I swallowed the massive lump of panic in my throat. "No," I admitted, my voice breaking. "No, it is not." The brutal, unvarnished honesty of that admission settled heavily between us, solidifying like concrete. It was final. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement, as if my non-answer was exactly what he had calculated, before he ever asked the question. "Do you love my dad?" he asked immediately, pivoting without warning. That specific question hit an entirely different nerve. Faster, sharper, deeply instinctual. "Yes," I blurted out instantly. It sounded defensive, practically rehearsed, and we both instantly knew it. Jackson tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he clinically studied my panicked face. "Do you?" he challenged quietly. I hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, but that microscopic hesitation screamed louder than any monologue I could have delivered. His jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle working. "Wow," he muttered under his breath, looking away toward the living room in utter disgust. "It is not like that, Jackson," I cried out quickly, desperately scrambling for footing, even though I didn't possess a remotely logical explanation. "It is exactly like that," he shot back, his eyes snapping back to mine, blazing with fresh anger. I physically stepped away from the counter, moving toward the center of the kitchen, my voice dropping to a desperate, pleading whisper. "You are 17 years old. You don't understand how adult relationships mutate and change over a decade," I begged. "Marriage isn't always this perfectly clear, clean, romantic thing." "Yeah, well," he fired back instantly, his voice dripping with venom. "Cheating is—" That single sentence entirely shut me down. It ripped the vocal cords right out of my throat, because there was absolutely no philosophical debate, no semantic loophole, no moral gray area that could possibly sanitize or undo the concrete reality of what I had done. We stood perfectly still in the agonizing silence once more. But this time, it felt entirely different. It felt like something fundamental had completely snapped. It felt like we had crossed an invisible boundary in the center of the kitchen, a point of no return where the damage was officially permanent. Jackson exhaled a long, heavy breath, reaching up to violently run his hand through his dark hair once more, looking incredibly exhausted. "So what happens now?" he demanded, his voice flat and dead. The question felt 1,000 times heavier than the first time he had asked it. It felt permanent. "I already told you, Jackson." I wept quietly, completely defeated. "I honestly don't know." He nodded, but it wasn't a gesture of agreement or sympathy. It was the grim acceptance of a reality he entirely despised. "Will I do?" he asked cryptically. My chest tightened in panic. "What exactly does that mean?" He locked his dark eyes directly onto mine, his gaze steady, uncompromising, and terrifyingly adult. "It means I am absolutely not keeping this dirty secret for you forever." Me heart physically dropped into my shoes. "Jackson, please." "I said forever, Elena," he interrupted sharply, his voice commanding the room. "Not right this second." I stopped crying for a moment, my brain desperately scrambling to process the nuance of his ultimatum. "Why not right now?" I asked cautiously, terrified of a trap. He held my frantic gaze for a very long, quiet minute before finally delivering his sentence. "Because I am giving you the opportunity to be an adult and do it yourself." The sheer weight of his maturity hit me like a runaway train. "You honestly think I won't do it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The fact that you even have to ask that question says absolutely everything," he replied coldly. I didn't attempt to argue because once again his logic was flawless. "But you need to understand something right now," he continued, pointing a finger directly at me, his voice ironclad. "I am not going to sit on this grenade forever. I am absolutely not going to smile and lie to my dad's face every single day, just to protect you. I am not asking you to lie for me." I cried out quickly. "You kind of are," he stated, entirely unfazed by my tears. The truth of his words stung fiercely. I just need a little bit of time," I pleaded, desperately bargaining. "Time for what?" "Exactly," he scoffed, crossing his arms. "To try and figure out a magical way to keep both of them." The brutal, devastating accuracy of his accusation made my face burn with intense shame. "No," I sobbed, even though the denial felt incredibly hollow and weak in my own chest. "Just time to finally figure out what I am going to do." He studied my broken, sobbing form incredibly carefully, analyzing whether I was a flight risk. "Then you better figure it out incredibly fast," he ordered. There was absolutely no lingering teenage angst or dramatic anger in his tone this time. It was pure, unfiltered seriousness. It was an ultimatum. "I will," I whispered, the words tasting like blood. Another heavy pause descended, and then the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted one final time. It wasn't the suffocating tension building up, it was the agonizing tension finally settling. It felt exactly like reaching the bitter, unavoidable end of a long, terrible road. Jackson slowly turned his head, glancing toward the dark hallway that led to the staircase, and then looked back at me one last time. "I really didn't want to see you like this," he said, his voice dropping to a remarkably quiet, almost gentle volume. The unexpected vulnerability in his statement completely caught me off guard. "Like what?" I choked out. "Like this," he repeated softly, vaguely gesturing at my trembling, tear-soaked form. "I honestly thought you were a better person than this, Elena." The profound, quiet disappointment radiating from his voice hurt infinitely more than any screaming match ever could have. It completely shattered whatever fragile pieces of my heart were left. "I am so sorry, Jackson," I sobbed, and for the very first time since this entire nightmare began, the apology wasn't a desperate reflex or a manipulation. It felt completely, devastatingly real. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the apology. But he absolutely didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't okay. It would never be okay again. "I am going up to my room," he announced, after a long moment, turning his back on me. "Jackson," I called out desperately, reaching a shaking hand out toward his retreating back, though I had absolutely no idea what words I could possibly offer to fix this. He paused at the edge of the kitchen tile, slowly looking back over his shoulder at me. "What?" he asked, his voice entirely hollow. I hesitated. 1,000 frantic, pleading sentences raced through my panicked mind. I could have begged him again. I could have tried to explain Julian one more time. I could have promised him the world, but looking at the exhaustion etched into his young face, absolutely none of it felt right. "Nothing," I finally whispered, letting my hand drop to my side. And then he turned and walked away into the dark hallway. Just like that, there was no slammed bedroom door echoing through the house. There was no theatrical, angry exit. He was just gone. The massive, open-concept kitchen instantly felt horribly, suffocatingly empty the absolute second he vanished from sight. It was far too quiet, far too still. I stood frozen in the exact center of the room for a very long time, staring blankly at the empty air, my mind violently replaying every single excruciating second of that confrontation on an endless, looping reel. He actually knew. He had known the truth for weeks, maybe months, and now my entire carefully constructed, pathetic double life had a ticking timer attached to it. Not because a teenager had aggressively threatened me with exposure, but because he possessed the terrifying moral clarity that I had completely abandoned, and he simply didn't have to threaten me. The walls were rapidly closing in. I slowly pushed myself away from the cold refrigerator door and looked around the pristine, expensive kitchen. I stared at the half-finished dinner prep scattered across the island. The heavy santoku knife was still sitting exactly where I had abandoned it on the wood. The pungent yellow onions I had never finished dicing. The physical environment looked completely, entirely the same as it had 30 minutes ago. But the reality was that absolutely nothing was the same. My entire universe had shifted on its axis. I dragged my heavy feet over to the large farmhouse sink, automatically reaching out and turning the chrome faucet on full blast. I just desperately needed the rushing sound of the water to shatter the deafening, oppressive silence of the empty house. Even though I had absolutely nothing to wash, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely control my fingers. I braced both palms hard against the slick edge of the wet counter, closing my eyes and fighting a massive wave of nausea, desperately trying to steady my racing heart. This was the end of the line. This was the exact, terrifying moment where every single lie, every deleted text message, and every stolen afternoon I had been frantically outrunning had finally caught up to me. I had a brutal binary choice to make. I could stubbornly keep going. I could frantically keep lying, desperately trying to manipulate Jackson, pretending like I could somehow maintain control of this burning building. Or I could finally stop. I could end the madness. I could pick up the phone, call Richard in Chicago, and tell him the absolute horrifying truth before he heard it from the mouth of his own teenage son, before the betrayal destroyed him in a permanent, apocalyptic way that I could never, ever repair. I squeezed my eyes shut, taking a slow, ragged breath that rattled violently in my chest. And then I slowly reached into my apron pocket and did the one single thing I had absolutely avoided doing this entire chaotic, cowardly time. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen illuminated my tear-stained face. My thumb hovered instinctively, almost magnetically, over Julian's name in my favorites list. Of course it did. That toxic electric pull was still undeniably there. It was so incredibly strong. It was familiar. It was the easy, cowardly escape hatch. But then the image of Jackson flashed in my mind, standing in this very kitchen, staring at me with those hollow, devastated eyes, looking at me like he genuinely didn't recognize the monster standing in front of him anymore. I thought about Richard, sitting in a sterile hotel room in Chicago, completely unaware, trusting my fidelity without a single question. And for the very first time since this entire catastrophic nightmare had begun, the crushing, unbearable weight of the guilt finally felt vastly heavier than the intoxicating thrill of the escape. My trembling thumb slowly moved away from Julian's contact. I scrolled down to Richard. I stared blindly at his name glowing on the bright glass screen for a long, agonizing second, the silence in the kitchen ringing in my ears. And then, before I could lose my nerve, I pressed call. I lifted the cold phone to my ear. It rang once, a sharp, digital tone. It rang twice. It rang 3 times. Every single ring made my heart slam harder and faster against my ribs, until I thought my chest might physically crack open. And when the line finally clicked, and he picked up the call, "Hey," Richard answered, his deep voice sounding completely normal, totally exhausted from a long day of meetings, entirely unaware, exactly the same as it had always been for the last 5 years. Hearing the absolute normalcy in his voice almost entirely broke my resolve. "Hey," I whispered back, my voice barely holding its structural shape, sounding like shattered glass. There was a brief, confusing pause on his end of the line. The ambient noise of a hotel lobby echoed faintly in the background. "Elena, are you okay?" he asked, genuine concern instantly bleeding into his tone. I closed my burning eyes tightly, took one massive final breath of air, and stepped directly off the cliff into the horrifying reality I had spent months desperately avoiding. "No," I said, and just like that, the entire world I had built began to violently fall apart.